Hello and welcome to How to Deal with Grief and Trauma. My name is Natalie Himmelrich. As you know, I thrive to have more male guests on the podcast, and I'm so glad that Andrew offered to speak from his personal experience of dealing with grief and trauma in many different situations. He speaks about divorce, both the divorce of his parents, as well as his own marriage, the death of both of his parents, and the loss of most of his family and friends as a result of that. As you will hear in today's episode, having experienced quite significant early childhood trauma, Andrew knows his boundaries and is clear on what he can talk about and where he prefers not to go deeper, which I'm guessing many of you listeners can relate to. Having clear boundaries is so important, especially dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder and the aftermath of a chronically dysregulated nervous system. Find out more by listening to today's episode. About this week's guest, Andrew Dupy is the CSO for Leaders Press, with a demonstrated history working in the publishing industry and more than 15 years of developing extensive customer, sales, support, management, and executive experience. Andrew has consistently fostered a productive and enriching work environment to upskill employees and grow business and leverage his knowledge, bearing, and charisma to generate return business by creating a community of long-term client relationships. Andrew became estranged from his biological father at an early age after the divorce of his parents due to the parents' abusive relationship, which also led to the estrangement from other members of their extended family. As a young adult, his mother died from cancer, and many years later Andrew also lost his stepdad from cancer. Just a few years after that, his own marriage ended in divorce. I really hope that today's episode and Andrew's insight will help you understand early childhood trauma and the effects of PTSD from much more in-depth experience. And just remember, whenever you need a break, just press pause and come back. Take care. So welcome, Andrew. It's nice that you took some time for us on the podcast. And I'm always glad to have a man sitting across Zoom from me and to hear males' voices. How are you doing today?
Well, in the context of the question you're asking, I'm doing okay. I think that is, I give that answer a lot. Many people will, I think, default to, oh, I'm doing great, or I'm doing well, or they do that. But I would say that I'm doing okay with the things in my life that I'm dealing with. I tread water and I make some waves.
Yeah. And just to give a little bit of context for the listener, Andrew and I have been speaking about the question, how are you today? And the context in which this is asked. And as you listener might know, I'm asking this question every guest that I have right at the beginning. And I want to tune in us, the listener, the person speaking, the interviewee, and myself into this topic. And so it's not a superficial question. And usually people don't answer with the weather or where they're from or what's happening, but actually tuning into what we're going to talk about and what that might bring up. And so it's as well for you as the listener to say, well, how am I doing today? And to take that seriously and to look after yourself in that, as well as if you're listening and something gets too much, as always in this podcast, you can always press pause and come back to it later. So why don't we start with you, Andrew, and telling us a little bit about your story of loss and trauma in your life?
Oh, yeah. Well, unfortunately, I'm someone that became very acquainted with death and loss at an age that probably was a little bit too young for it. I mean, I had a relatively stable life growing up, but I was a child of divorce, so I had to endure that as very young. I think that's very common in America. But I had a fairly good family life after that. My mother remarried. My stepfather was basically my dad. But one of the things that just became an issue with me in my life is by that trauma of divorce, I'd already kind of lost a lot of family. And I lost my biological father, who became estranged. I lost a lot of my mother's family, who became estranged from her because of her divorce. So it was very much a very small family growing up, and then, well, people started dying, and that's something we all have to deal with. But I started having to deal with it in my 20s. First with my mom with cancer, and then with my dad just a few years ago in 2019, and then after all of that kind of became the realization I had no family anymore. After that was a divorce that followed and lost the family that I had made. So my issue with grief and loss has really been really just in the last few years, even having lost everyone except for just a few close friends.
And just within a couple of minutes, you made it very clear that most of the people in your life disappeared, left,
Yep.
died, got estranged. How do you deal with this situation? How do you deal with being a human being that feels, to some degree, now I'm putting words into your mouth, but it sounds quite alone or lonely.
Yeah, and that actually becomes a little bit of the issue. Dealing with it it's never easy. It's something in which I tried to reach out, obviously, and build as many new relationships as possible. I think that was something that was really important, especially after my divorce. I had to realize I need to make new friends. I need to build new communities, because when you go through divorce, you also lose friends communities. I lost many, many mutual friends that just were like, I'm no longer comfortable knowing you because of the trauma of all of this situation. So branching out, meeting new people. But really, I haven't found an exact answer to everything. There hasn't been a quick solution to just say, oh, there's a way to make all of this feel better and to make myself feel like, I have a family or a life. Some of it has been reaching out to distant family members. A little bit of it has been trying to rebuild a relationship with my brother, which that's one we won't go into, but that's not something that's quite so easy. But yeah, it really has been trying to forge new connections and trying also to become even more outgoing and direct in my business life. Trying to, moving on from different positions to becoming a podcaster, which is something that I've done to, try again to build those kind of rapport and continue to connect to people.
So we're going to put all those links in the show notes, but Andrew himself has a podcast called Leaders Talk, and you can go and listen to Andrew interviewing those people. Maybe let's start with the earliest loss you mentioned, and they might have been prior to that, but you mentioned divorce. How old were you when your parents divorced?
Oh, I was 3 years old.
Okay.
So very, very young, but it was still an extremely traumatic experience. Being able to see that, those are some of, unfortunately, my earliest memories were of the horrible fights and the scenarios that led to the actual divorce, which I won't go into too much of that now, but it did create what was, I think, a long-term PTSD that just began right there of seeing those kind of horrible situations and realizing that families can fall apart. Realizing that at 3 years old is a little bit difficult to swallow.
So for people who might be challenged with abbreviations, so PTSD stands for post-traumatic stress disorder. Tell us a little bit about what you've experienced. One of the most common symptom we know of post-traumatic stress is flashbacks. But tell us a little bit how you as a child experienced PTSD or the long-term effect of that, so that people might be able to relate to.
Yeah, and I think flashbacks are the thing that are the most problematic. And it's not doesn't have to necessarily be the traditional, you suddenly find yourself in that situation flashback. And I think that becomes something that people get a little confused by. It's like, do you do like the movie says, and all of a sudden there's the flash and you're in that experience. For me, it's never that way. But it still exists. It's like whenever I am around extremely, I would say, violent situations where someone, even if it's someone that's just venting and just starts yelling and screaming about something that, they got their foot stuck in a door, or they, the garbage wasn't taken out on time. those kind of things trigger emotional responses in me that are extremely defensive, even if it has nothing to do with me. Which I'm sure was part of the things that led to people becoming estranged and divorced. I'm very jumpy. Someone comes up to me behind me and I don't know they're there, I freak out. And that, because of like, you run into situations in your life where people don't really understand. It's like, all I did was tap you on the shoulder and you yelled. Like, I know it's not your fault. I did that because that creates to me a kind of a fear defensive protection response, and it has nothing to do with you, but that does end up leading to people not necessarily understanding what you're going through, not necessarily understanding or relating to what your mental state is to make you do those kind of things. But I think that for me is one of the things that trauma would do, is that things that would occur in my life would remind me of past traumas, like, my biological father's abuse of my mother. That would come in, and the things that he would do would sometimes be triggered by other things in the environment. I think that would be the way that flashbacks would work in that situation, for me, at least.
Yeah. So I'm using the podcast sometimes as well as to teach people about what I hear. And it might even help you if you haven't heard that. But basically what happens in a situation that you describe, when someone comes behind you and taps you on the shoulder and you react, is like your nervous system is activated by such a response, which is familiar, and then it gets activated very quickly, very high. And this is because trauma leaves often an imprint of a chronically dysregulated nervous system, meaning the nervous system's purpose is to regulate you from being in a state of rest and digest to a little bit of activation. Sometimes you need fight and flight in normal situations, or you get a little bit scared if something is like a big noise suddenly, and then you get deactivated again and you go into rest and digest. So it's like a meandering up and down line. But in a traumatic or after trauma, a body can be chronically dysregulated. So that baseline, that wavy line, actually goes up. So the system is much more normally in activation. That uses a lot of energy. A lot of protection mechanisms come in, because there's always the next thing could happen. So there's a hypervigilance as well. And so people have to express it, and they might relate to the fact that if something happened that has been traumatic, the body just doesn't feel safe easily. And it needs to be relearned, and that takes time and work or effort or therapy or somatic approach, kind of work, trauma-informed care. But just as a feedback as well for people to understand what's happening, just like the people in your surrounding who didn't understand, it's because there's still a lot of education that can happen in terms of the general public in regards to traumatized people.
Yeah. I think that was one of the things that I've had a hard time dealing with, especially after the divorce, because at that point I lost my built family, my support structure that I had for at that point 13 years. Is that you have to expect that people aren't going to necessarily understand. And when I began to get out and meet new people, I don't necessarily mean dating, I just mean growing and building a new community of friends. I did find that there were people that I couldn't relate to because they didn't have the necessarily the same kind of life experiences, the same kind of experiences. And I began to just accept that not everyone is going to be able to just instantly understand what I'm going through. So I kind of had to be a little more choosy of who I'm becoming friends with and who I'm branching out to try and rebuild relationships with, because I find that I relate better to people that have had similar experiences to me now.
Yeah, because your nervous system is vibrated at a similar frequency as so, and people say, well, yeah, that's my kind of normal. The term normal in itself is funny because it depends on what you've been going through. Your normal changes, and especially when you were talking a little bit later in your story about your mother's death from cancer, that in itself changes a person. It doesn't just leave a young adult say, okay. And especially with a mother, it's not as common to think, well, if you're married and you divorce, maybe you find someone else, maybe you get remarried. Well, with a mother, it's a one-time thing. And if you If your mother died, nothing's going to replace a mother. Even a stepmom doesn't necessarily replace a mother.
Oh, no. In my case, especially not.
Yeah. So you were quite a young forming adult. You said in your 20s.
Yeah, I was in my early 20s when my mother died. I was actually in college. So I had to do a whole lot of juggling and growing up very, very quickly when that happened. Because not only was I still in college, so I had to complete my education. I did not drop out. I went right through and I still got cum laude. So, but that wasn't easy, and it probably wasn't even necessarily the best idea for me to do. But I also had to be there for my dad, who was not handling it well, and he needed the support structure because he was distant from his family as well. So it was really just he and I, and he had to do his job and go to work and continue to pay the bills. And I moved in with him, and there was a lot that I put on my plate in my early 20s that I probably should have spent doing the things that we do in our early 20s instead.
Yeah. So then you mentioned in 2019 your dad died. So that's the dad you just mentioned you moved into with when your mother died.
My stepdad, but I call him my dad.
Yeah. How many years was in between your mother dying and your stepdad or your dad dying?
It was almost 20 years of separation and distance from it. And his death was fairly sudden, which was the difference between my mother. I mean, my mother took years, which was a trauma in and of itself, not one that I really want to go into. With him, it was very sudden, even though it was stage 4 cancer, just for some reason didn't go diagnosed. So it was overnight, him basically being there and then him not being there, which was, I was older. I was more prepared to deal with it. I had a wife that gave me a support structure I didn't have with my mom. My stepmother was not so pleasant. In fact, she refused to even bury him.
So let me get that straight. So the dad that you're describing now that
he remarried
died,
after my mom died. Yeah.
He remarried. Okay.
Yeah, and my stepmother was not a particularly nice person. She when he died, she basically just said, "Yeah, you handle everything." Which for me, just starting a new job and the position I was in was very difficult. So that was another kind of just difficult blow, where a lot of stuff got put on my plate that I didn't necessarily have the capability of handling, but had to do it with, again, very little to no support structure outside of everything.
Yeah. So this is interesting in terms of looking at the differences and the similarities. And I want to put a sentence before that in terms of comparing, because I often say comparing losses is not helpful unless the losses are experienced by the same person and we can learn something from it. So in your case, you have experienced both losses. So it's your mom when you were 20, like a young adult, and then your dad when you were almost 40. And you said that the difference was your mom was a long process and your father was, or your dad was, very short. How would you think that or feel that has impacted you, those different kind of losses, in terms of age, in terms of its preparation or its story before, as opposed to a sudden, unexpected or more or less unexpected loss? So how would you say that has been different for you?
I mean, that's actually a really good question. It's probably not something I can go into in just 20 minutes. It's definitely, my mother's loss is still more traumatic in many ways because of the age that it came at and because of the circumstances around it, because of, the actual fact that I saw her deteriorate in front of my eyes. And, I was there when she died, which was very different from my dad, which was a phone call that I got early in the morning, which both are terrible. But there is a slightly easier process when I lost my dad. I mean, that I don't like to say those words because I think people, when they think about that, it's like, no, neither one of them was easy. But was I able to deal with it better? I think I was, because I was able to at least think about him the way that I knew him more than the way that I saw how he had lost himself over time, which he really didn't do. It came, like I say, fairly quickly. Between his diagnosis and his death was a matter of months, and he was lying to me the entire time, saying, "Oh, it's fine. I've got everything under control." And he was just trying to do that to make sure I didn't worry. Which that was him. But yeah, the differences in them, I think, really comes in that how much of that pre-trauma is still built in, because I'll still be very upset about losing my mom, but I probably think more about my dad than her at this point. But I think that's really just because it's the fresher of the two, and he and I had a different relationship. It wasn't always as good, but it wasn't bad either.
Yeah, grief and remembering the person who we lost, it is not logical. I mean, I had this experience personally and also with my clients time and time again. And it's something that we often, just like with the nature of the mind, we want to understand, why does this affect me this way and this way? But there's no logic. It's just, this affects me the way it does and the other. So it's no point at arguing with how we are affected by it. But given the timeline, you said between 2019 and today, so 4 years later, you also had a divorce in between here and then. So there was multiple loss situations. What resources and insight have helped you to be where you are today?
Where I am today, my biggest resource that has helped me be where I am today has been my friends group. I mean, has been the people that were close to me, that in some cases, I hadn't even really known how close they were until, I said, well, I'm getting a divorce. And many of them just immediately rolled in, okay, how can I help? What can I do for you? And that's both men and women that, were like, do you need a place to stay if anything really goes bad? Which, I didn't, fortunately. Or, what can we do to help you talk, to help you vent? I connected with an old professor of mine, and she was an enormous help to me. That I hadn't talked to her in years, and when I said what was going on, she was like, let's go have a beer. Let's sit down and just talk everything out. So I think turning to my friends as a support structure was very important. I have not done as much therapy as I need to, and I think that's something that is actually really important for a lot of people, and I haven't had the time. Has been what most of it has been. I think that would probably be a answer that a lot of people would say, is that work in business, I don't have the time necessarily to go out and get a therapist. I would recommend that you do so, though, because the little that I have had has been enormous help just to talk, just to actually sit there and share what you're feeling, and just have some kind of a sounding board of someone that's not necessarily attached or judgmental. But I think that's really been what's been important for me, is just building that support structure, having support at work too. I mean, that's been something that's been very helpful there. My boss, Alinka, is very understanding, and she's she's known me long enough to know when I'm not 100%. So she's very much was like, what do we need to do to help you? And we did that. So.
How do you think your losses and the traumatic aspect of your mother's deterioration, and also the experience of that volatile relationship between your mother and father, how do you think that has shaped you in your life?
I think that for the most part, it has been a positive influence on me. I know that's a strange thing to say necessarily, but I look at myself and I am the sum of all of those things that came before. Many of those things made me a little bit harder than I probably would be otherwise. Some of them made me a little bit softer than I would probably be otherwise. My biological father taught me a way not to be as a person, and as a husband, and as a father, which, having a roadmap of what to avoid is that early in your life can be turned into a positive thing, because it made a lot of impressions on me. But yeah, I hate to say that I wouldn't have it any other way, because there's always sometimes the thought of, what if I could just reverse all of these things? What if I could make them better? What if my mom lived all the way until today? I would much prefer that to my current reality, but I wouldn't be me anymore if those things hadn't happened. And I have learned that one of the important things to do is to try and find that you can still like yourself after all of these things happen. There's still the core of you. You can still, despite all the bad things you can feel, you can still look at yourself and still look at yourself in the mirror and say, I'm still a good person. I still like myself. I can still turn these things into something I can build on. So a very long-winded kind of rambling answer to your question. That's how I feel about it. I feel like it made me a better person than I necessarily would have been otherwise. Just in fact that those experiences were things that shaped me in ways that I didn't expect them to do.
So you mentioned a couple of things. I want to circle back to therapy and not enough, but then you also said you would actually think it's good. I want to just put a thought in there for you and anyone listening to that who's actually maybe thinking, should I not, or I don't have the time. One of the things that is really beneficial and is actually not such a long thing to do in terms of reducing the nervous system's activation, speed and time is EMDR. Eye movement desensitization, reprocessing. So that will be something as well for people who think about, well, how can I do that? How can I avoid talk therapy for years? That is a way for the trauma response or, the reaction to be dimmed down or the loudness to be tuned down. But what would you wish if someone listening to this and can relate to either it be early divorce of an abusive parental relationship or losses of parents or divorce, as in your case, what would you want them, if they were at the beginning of their grieving and healing journey, what would you want them to know?
That there will be improvement. I think that's really important. When it begins, you don't feel like there's going to be. There really is a pit of grief at the beginning of all of it, in which you kind of think to yourself, well, this is how I'm going to feel from now on. And it can stick around for a while. And strangely enough, with my divorce, it's probably the one that stuck around the longest, because, there's still kind of an active trauma with that. Death is a closed door. You get over it. You have to, or you destroy yourself. That's basically how I looked at it. Once this is over with, I have to start moving on. Next day is next day. Next day after that is next day after that. With divorce, there's something still there. There's something that still kind of lingers that just continues to eat at you, or it has with me for a while, especially if the other party doesn't feel the same in that situation. It becomes something that kind of makes you feel bad about yourself. So that's my suggestion to people that begin this. It feels like it's a pit. It feels like you're going to feel this bad for a very long time. And sometimes you're going to think it's going to feel like this forever, but you're not. It does get better. And I think the way that it gets better is by trying to find and concentrate on the things that you're building on that are positive about what's happening to you. And it's that whole thing, always look on the bright side of life. It's not an easy thing to do, and you might be in the most terrible situation possible. But if you can look at something and find what are there possible positive outcomes that could be from the situation, I would recommend doing so and starting to try and build on those actively, rather than thinking this is just my grief is now my grief and this is how I'm going to live.
And you mentioned the one thing that was important for you and the bright side that you didn't even expect in certain situations, which was your support system, which you mentioned earlier on, where you said you had friends who turned up and they were there right in the moment and supported you, which you didn't even expect specifically from those kind of people. And I want to highlight that because the support system is one of the most mentioned, I can't say all the time, but it's one of the most mentioned resources that people draw upon. And I want to tie it back to the nervous system because this is how we regulate our nervous system to the most benefit, which is through co-regulation. So someone there who is there even if they don't say anything, actually, the presence itself helps to regulate the nervous system. So look out to those people who are there, or find the people that could be supporting you. As you were saying, you find you relate most to people who have experienced what you have, whose nervous system is in the same way, somehow swinging with you.
Yeah, and when I haven't found those people, I've actually tried to seek some of them out. I mean, I've looked into groups that have people in it that have had similar experiences to mine. I think that the support group system is very beneficial, because when you're surrounded by people that have similar experiences to your own, you then have people that you can relate to and can share some of your ideas and see how they've dealt with it. So that's why I feel that, this venue is valuable, just to sharedly talk about what we've had happen to us.
Yeah. So thank you so much, Andrew, for sharing your story, your personal way of dealing with loss and trauma, with your experiences. Shall we go into rapid fire questions?
Sure.
So as I say always, these are the 5 questions that I end my podcast with, and they always go the same way, and you just find an ending to the sentence that I'm going to say. Okay. So grieving and trauma means?
Pain.
And healing means?
Forgiveness.
And what I have learned about myself in the light of loss and trauma?
That I have learned very little about myself.
That you have learned very little about yourself, you think?
Over my course of my life, yeah. I've learned more about myself after the loss and trauma than before.
Okay. And one thing you wish people knew about loss and trauma?
That it can be gotten over. It can get better.
And so one specific thing that has changed since your losses and trauma that you wouldn't want to miss, what is that?
The one specific thing that has changed for me since my loss and trauma, I have learned to accept liking myself more.
I need to think about that. I have learned to accept liking myself more. Is that what you said?
Yeah, that was that. I'll elaborate just a little bit on that.
Yeah, please do.
But so I think that one of the things that before my loss and trauma, I had not actually tried to be friends with myself. I had always tried to be friends with other people. I had always tried to fill, whatever needs that I had personally with family or friends or wife or in-laws or however it tried to do it. It wasn't always a fit. And one of the things that I've realized, especially now when I was finally really, truly alone, was that I've got to get okay with this person, with me, with the person I look at myself in the mirror with every day. And I have to start becoming comfortable with myself more than myself is a part of all of these things that I had spent my whole life being part of. So I think that's what I mean by that. I learned to start liking myself better.
I like that. Thank you. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you so much for your time and for your willingness to be with what is today, and that willingness with also the vulnerability that might bring up for those people listening who can relate to another man going through those tough times in life. Thank you so much, Andrew.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to How to Deal with Grief and Trauma. If you'd like to be updated on future episodes, please subscribe to our newsletter on nataliehimmelrich.com. If you need grief support, please contact me for a 30 minutes free discovery session. How to Deal with Grief and Trauma is produced and edited by me, Natalie Himmelrich. To support this podcast, please rate, review, and subscribe to or follow the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you. And remember to keep breathing. I promise it will get easier.